Hello, everyone. Today on the Doctor Who Guide, I am super excited to be interviewing a very special guest, one of the fellow contributors to Dracuris Distributors' 1997 unofficial Doctor Who annual. Andrew Parsons is an incredible Doctor Who artist, fan, and cosplayer, and I am so grateful for you to join me today. I'm excited to talk about both of our contributions to the annual, but you also have done artwork for other annuals as well, Blake 7, things like the Avengers. So I'm super excited to also touch on those as well. Thank you so much for joining me today.
You're very welcome.
Oh, behind you is this incredible outfit and cosplay for that you do for the Seventh Doctor. Look at that. That is so cool.
Yeah, it's a custom umbrella. I nicked the top of um, uh, a factory-made Abbey shot one and put it on a vintage umbrella, so it's got the wooden tip. So it's actually more accurate than the ones you buy in the shops. But and it works too. So it's on its first outing, I got caught in a gale force storm with rain at a Doctor Who convention, and the handle didn't come off. So I was very pleased with my handiwork there.
That is so cool. That's so impressive. I love that. I love seeing how different cosplayers can not only take the official things, but really, I mean, the goal for all of us is to get it as screen accurate as possible. And so that's really, really cool that you modified your umbrella. So that's awesome. That's awesome. Seventh Doctor subjects aside, we'll move on to the Eighth Doctor. If you haven't yet,
Yes.
um, definitely check out and get the 1997 unofficial annual from Trackers Distributors. Oh, look, you've got the Carolyn Edwards cover.
Oh yeah.
This is the Mark Worgan cover and the Chris Marola cover here. And so, oh, I'm so excited. I do have the third one as well here. And it really is just a marvelous celebration of the Eighth Doctor. What was you've illustrated, you did the character illustrations for a short story called Manhattan Transference
Hmm.
by Paul Burns, I believe. Is it Paul Burns?
That's
Yeah.
right.
And so that story is one of the first in the annual, which is always very exciting. I mean, the further you are to the beginning, the more likely everybody is to read your story. So that's very exciting. And it also kind of sets the tone. So we'll talk about that story. You also did the illustrations for The Worry short story towards the end of the book. So your illustrations do kind of bookend this annual, which is kind of a cool thought.
Yeah, they're also there's a few more dotted through the annual as well. So at the last minute, I was asked to provide four illustrations of Sard the Ice Warrior and kind of a portrait for the planets of the not sea devils but devils of the sea, which was a last minute one. They said, "Can you do this four more?" Yeah, no problem. So I did four Ice Warrior portraits, put a bit of noise over them to make it look like they were on a comms transmission, and they're in there as well. So I think in total I've got something like about 13 or 14 illustrations dotted throughout the whole annual. So that's kind of cheating because one of mine is split into two for the worry. So I actually got five in there.
Yes, yes. Yeah, it was Devils of the Sea Planet, which
Uh,
was a fun
yes,
little
Devils of the Sea Planet. That's the one. I knew it wasn't
right.
quite Sea Devils, but yeah,
It's
it was a while
absolutely a
ago
play on
that I
that.
illustrated that. So, but yeah, we've been working on it since 2021, and again, it's been in production since before then. So it was, yeah, it's great to see so much great content in there. The writing's good, and my work with Terraquius is kind of not quite by accident, but my first dealings with them was within the previous annual for 1988, where I approached them. I'd done some work for the Avengers, and I thought, oh, that's Doctor Who's my thing. Haven't really officially illustrated anything, so I approached Mark and said, I've done some stuff. Do you need any illustrations? And yeah, yeah. So I did some work for the 88 annual. And at this time, I was actually recovering from some illness. I was at home a lot, learning digital art. So what you see with my 88 annual stuff, and also with the worry, which was what I was asked to do first, is actually beginning to learn how to draw digitally. So I've been drawing for 40 odd years. We know traditionally I went to art college in the late 80s, early 90s, but actually that's not been my career. So during the pandemic and the lockdowns we had over in the UK, nothing to do in the evenings, so I taught myself how to draw digitally. Bit of a curve, um, but so what you see there is the beginnings of me drawing. Almost the beginnings. The Avengers was the first one, which was much simpler to do because it was just straight portraits. Um, but after I'd done the Colin Baker one, Mark got in touch, said, could you do an Eighth Doctor one? Yeah, I could do that. So he sent me over the Worry to Read, which was fantastic. I mean, it's one of those amazing stories whereby, as you're reading it, the images pop into your head. I have a very visual imagination, so actually, I had about 10 different things I could draw first without thinking about it. I thought, well, this is great. I can do that. So I whittled it down to four, which got divided into say five in the annual eventually. Um, and that's the last I heard of it for a little while. Then a little later on in 2022, Mark got in touch again and said, "Well, we've got this story by Paul Burns. Paul is actually someone I've known at conventions, but not to talk to and know by name for quite a few years. I know who he is now, and we keep in touch. And he said, there's this one called Manhattan Transference. Have a look at it. It says we actually need to make some tweaks to the artwork. So we've got a really good background artist who we just need to have some character artwork to go in the foreground. So that's actually like a double-handed one. So that was done end of last year. By that time, I'd already done more color work. So hence the reason it's slightly more, it jumps out the page, the color is better. And those are people that sort of spend time poring over the artwork might notice the technique's a bit better as well. Because I've been digital illustrating for an extra year and a bit by the time I'd done that. And again, the beginning of 2023, that's when the Devils of the Sea Planet, or the other, whichever order those words come in, was commissioned effectively. So yeah, it's been a long one. As you know, that was good for me anyway. That was 2 years worth of work off and on. And I know it was in production long before that, because I know a lot of people have been waiting a long time for that annual. So, but it's what an annual it is. Well worth it in the end.
Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely, I think, since early on, that when people saw that these annuals are filling in gaps where the official annuals never had a release for that year, and so I think quite a few people were excited at the thought of a 1997 annual for the Eighth Doctor, because we got yearbooks during that time, but never a proper official Eighth Doctor annual, because he was on for such a brief amount of time. But you're right, you absolutely nailed it on the head, that it was in production definitely since before 2021. I got involved in 2021, and I think about June was when I heard about it and wrote my story in June or July. So absolutely, it has been really cool to know about this project, but then you had to keep quiet about it for so long, and we were all waiting for, like, when can we share the news, and it was hard to keep that secret.
Yeah, it's also second nature for most artists. Once they've done something, they say, "Look what I've done! Look what I've done!" To either a select audience, and really the only people I could show were obviously the producers of the annual, but sort of close friends and family, and say, "Look, don't tell him about this. Look at this nice picture of a nice warrior I've done," and things like that. It's a nice warrior being held at gunpoint by two World War One soldiers. Which that one was actually great fun to draw. So the other thing I do as well is cosplaying. I'm a 1940s reenactor as well. So hence the reason I have a waistcoat there, which it hasn't got question marks on, but I do have a question mark pullover somewhere. And so 1940s military uniform I'm quite good at, because I go to a lot of events with a lot of people dressed as 1940s soldiers. In fact, I have a 1940s RAFC uniform here. But the uniforms were very, very different in World War One. So I had to do a bit more research on what would they have worn in a trench, because I've seen films, I've seen documentaries, never really paid too much attention to where do the buttons go, where's the rank go, oh, it's on the sleeve, that sort of thing. And I had to learn how to draw a Winchester rifle, which was interesting. So yeah, looking at my Google search results when I was doing that was 3D models of Winchester rifles, so I could just get the angles right, or World War One. So that was great fun to research. And the beauty of that story as well, is that Sard has to wear a poncho, so I'd have to draw the little lumps and bumps on his carapace. So I made that, when in doubt, go for the simple route.
Absolutely. Every story kind of had its own journey of how do we cover up Sard so that everybody doesn't immediately freak out at this gigantic Martian
Yeah,
wandering around.
another reason I like the Warriors, the Manhattan Transference that Paul wrote is, again, very quickly puts a cape on, so there's not
Yes.
much of him to draw.
Yes, yes. Oh my goodness. So I just want to reiterate here, for Manhattan Transference, written by Paul Burns, you did the character illustrations. Richard Jones did the background illustrations. For The Worry, it was by Andrew McDonald, and you did the illustrations for that. And of course, you did the Devils of the Sea Planet transmissions. So Paul Bensalem wrote that, and you did the illustrations for that. And I've got to say, I recommend, obviously reading this annual cover to cover, but just going to each of the Devils of the Sea Planet transmissions is really fun because, it's 4 different transmissions from Sard, and it just talks about his research and has a lot of funny references and moments. But and each one has that lovely sort of TV shot of him, in different positions and such. And so we will take a look at that artwork in just a second. But I loved what you talked about of, how when you're reading something, you're a very visual reader. It's, for me, oftentimes it is playing out like a movie in my head. There are angles, there's characters, there's backgrounds and stuff. And so, when you are planning out and having to whittle it down to a certain number of illustrations, I think it is important to look at, okay, what are the most important moments to be drawing the reader's attention to be capturing. But you've also kind of got to think of the layout because, if you did 4 illustrations all at the very front of the story, then you'd have none at the end. And so there's that pacing to think about too. What was kind of your process for prioritizing one moment over the other? Was it down to, I need one for the beginning, the middle, the end, or was it more about what struck you emotionally and you thought, oh, I have to illustrate this moment?
Yeah, it's kind of a bit of both. So you kind of divide. The brief is 4 illustrations. I mean, I've done 5 for Manhattan Transference because I thought the idea of drawing a guy who's had too much liquor was too good an opportunity to miss. But it's basically divide the story up into 4 and see if there's any major points that sort of jump out. I mean, sometimes with something like Manhattan Transference, that was great. There were actually very key points, almost equidistant, where you think, I want to draw that. That's a good moment. With Stacey holding up the microphone. That's your, big swelling sort of fanfare music in the back, incidental music in the background moment when she sort of puts the mic up in the air. So sometimes they just present themselves. And with The Worry, and also in the 88 annual, I illustrated the cover of the blue box. That was a case of there's so much going on it. You could draw that as a comic strip, no problem at all. So, but that was very straightforward because that was my first story where I illustrated. Other than that, I've done illustrations just like portraits, like in the Avengers, it's many portraits. So to illustrate the story, I just went back to Mark and said, "Any pointers?" And he said, "Yes, divide it into 4 and pick something in that quarter." So that's a good starting point. And sometimes when you pick a quarter, you think, well, there's not a lot going on there. So you have your establishing shot. Spoiler alerts, by the way, if anyone's not read the annual. And so the one for Manhattan Transference is the Doctor, Stacey and Sard coming out of the TARDIS into New York. That was always in my head going to be like, that's your splash page. If you're doing a comic, that's the big one pager with the title on it. And then pick out the key points. So Face Lost coming out of the subway at the Doctor. Or I did kind of give a little tip of the hat to Chris Achilleos on that one for the Target books, having the little circle with the Doctor's face in it. So that was kind of a intentional, and just picking out the key points. And I could not resist drawing a picture of the Rani, and trying to capture Kate O'Mara's likeness. I was basically So I said, well, do you want Kato Mara or do you want, one of the big Finnish Ranis? They said, be whoever you like. It can be a different Rani. We don't mind. So I thought, well, it's got to be Kate, isn't it? So again, lots of research of Kato Mara, lots of prep sketches. I mean, really, she's got such a great face. How could you not, try and emulate that with that sort of arms folded and looking, really slightly annoyed look, like get out of my way, sort of thing. But also trying to make her look like Paul's brief in the story. So the hair has to be up. It's set in the early 2000s, so I did a bit of research into trying to remember what did clothing look like in the early 2000s. I wasn't really wearing women's suits in the early 2000s. So again, going back over sort of old-fashioned pictures to get the sort of cut right, and also trying not to make her look like Missy, because with the hair up and wearing a suit, it was very easy to look like Michelle Gomez. So the two actually are quite similar facially in certain aspects. So my first attempt just looked just like Missy. So I thought, no, that's not right. So I had to sort of make the hair a little less tied up in a bun, so that people didn't get the wrong Time Lord. So that was great fun. And again, the whole trying to get the essence of what Lee Sullivan did in the comic strips, which again was something very different when I did the first one. Trying to find any online reference to the Radio Times comic strips, which I'll be honest, I didn't get the Radio Times in 1996, so I missed them, and it's not available to buy anywhere else. I could find a couple of snippets online, a couple of frames. So again, that's why Stacey's wearing a poncho most of the pictures in the first one, because apart from the sleeves and the shoulders, I didn't know what the rest of her uniform looked like. I've since got access to those Radio Times, so for the second one, I could do a slightly better version of the uniform, though I seem to have avoided the low cut top, which a lot of other illustrators seem to have used in the annual, and kept it a bit more utilitarian. So in terms of canon, in my head, it's closer to when Stacey first joined the TARDIS, when she was still wearing her uniform from the first comic strip. So, but yeah, with each story, there are key moments that, cliffhanger moments. You think you need to illustrate that, and just to keep the reader's attention, because you can't have if all the actions at both ends of the story, you've got to have something in the middle, otherwise it's just loads of text. So
Yeah.
thinking about layout as well to an extent, but there's no hard and fast rule. It's whatever feels right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so many of the things you mentioned, resonated. Reading it is absolutely so important that, you don't have, a lot of pages of text, because even though it's big and it's in those columns, it affects the pace that you're going at. And it's always more exciting to turn the page and see beautiful illustrations. And this annual is just chock full of them in so many different styles. I wasn't expecting it, but it does make sense to hear that, there were facial similarities between Kate O'Mara and Michelle Gomez, because, a lot of people, before we kind of found out about Missy, when people they just assumed that either Missy was the Ronnie, or just any female Time Lord comes on the scene and everybody's like, it's the Ronnie, and we haven't yet had that yet. And so it was quite fun for me reading the story, because I didn't see that coming. And so as a reader, as soon as that reveal came, I was like, oh, I should have known from the hints that came before. And then you turn the page and you're like, oh my gosh, that is so cool. So yeah, that's a really fun thing. And as we talk about Manhattan Transference, in my story, The Edge of Oblivion, which was illustrated by Chris, we're both Americans, and I think the only Americans to contribute to the annual. So to see a story set in New York and Manhattan in America and it's not at all written or drawn by the Americans, was very, very fun for me and very enjoyable, and I think you all did a great job with it. But I thought, oh, how ironic, we my story was set entirely all within the TARDIS too, and you're right. I got to to have the pleasure of working with Chris to figure out, what moments we wanted to highlight and when. And so my story did also have that initial cover illustration, and then an ending page one, which was a full page one. And I loved the one that you did of Stacy that ended up being a full page illustration. Did you know from the start that, okay, this one I'm doing is going to be a full page illustration? Because I have talked with other artists who, they did a half page originally, and then they were told, oh, actually, we'd love to make this a full page.
Yeah. So I think it was nice that it was always going to be portrait sort of arrangement. So quite a tall picture. So it's quite nice to see that it basically became it's a key moment in the story. So quite rightly, it's a key illustration in the story. So it was great to see that it was so large. And yeah, there have been tweaks to other stories as well. So for example, the final picture I did for The Worry was originally one illustration, comic strip style, cut into two, with the Doctor. Spoiler alerts, by the way, if anyone's not read the annual, holding a ornate flask for reasons, and then the bottom picture was a silhouette of the TARDIS, with this smoke going in through the lamp of all places. So that got divided into two. And the other amendment that I was asked to do by Mark was the original illustration in the Worry was originally sort of landscape of Sard coming out of the TARDIS and Stacey in the foreground, sort of looking at something. And the decision was made that was going to be a full page illustration, but with text and the title on the above it. So I had to adapt that illustration and continue it above where I'd originally drawn it, so that it was a A4, but with all the action happening at the bottom. So it was the top part was all very dark, slightly grade sort of gradated, graduated, and with rain and lots of grain on it, so that it had that sort of slightly gritty, wet World War One sort of feel to it. I can think of a word there. Bleh, it's probably the it had to feel dark and grimy and cold and uncomfortable. So, but yeah, that's the only time I had to end basically another 2/3 to the top of the picture. Originally, it was a landscape picture, so it was quite nice to get some direction back from the people when they do that. Do you know what? This would be really good if it was tall. I'm thinking, okay, I'm learning how to do this art package. How do I do it without drawing it all again? And so those little things certainly help your learning curve.
Absolutely. I mean, you talked about learning to do art digitally. What was that like? What was the program that you taught yourself for? I mean, that's a huge
so by the time I'd got to the Doctor Who annuals, I originally started using Affinity Designer, which is kind of a Affinity Photo, Affinity Designer for the Avengers, and my first Blake Seven book, which was an anthology called Forever Raven. So the Forever Raven picture was my very first digital one. So I was chuffed a bit from the time, but when you look back at them now, you can see they're quite basic, and you go back and think, I do that differently now, for reasons. But by the time I'd got to the Doctor Who annual, I'd progressed on to Clip Studio, Paint, CSP, because it does give you a bit more manipulation around frames. So you can do comic strip frames. Should you wish to do speech bubbles, it's got those built in. It's got more materials. So it's really designed. It was designed originally, it was Manga Studio. And quite a few years back, I managed to pick up a cheap version in a sale of Manga Studio. And the interface back then, this is going back to like 2008, so quite an old version of it. I thought, let's give this a go. I couldn't fucking get my head around it. It was awful. So Clip Studio is much easier to use. And also I've started using a display tablet as well, which I picked up cheap in a sale in the first couple of months of lockdown. So I'm now, instead of using a mouse, I'm using a sort of a stylus to draw, which is much nicer if you're used to using pen and ink and a pencil.
Yes, so, I can imagine. I am familiar. I've heard of both Clip Studio Paint and Manga Studio. That's very, very cool. I feel for you with and I'm impressed by the transition. edited for I think about 9 or 10 years on something called Sony Vegas. Well, before then, a series of whatever free programs I could get. And then a couple years ago, I decided to make the transition to Premiere Pro. And my goodness, if you've worked with Adobe products, you know that just the learning curve initially, if you don't know anything, is hard. But I knew everything a slightly different way from Sony Vegas, and I'm like, oh, I used to do this thing, I used to do that thing, and so the just making that transition, now I do know my way around it, but it's not an easy thing to do, and so I admire you, diving into that world of digital art, and of
Yeah,
course,
YouTube was my friend, definitely.
yes.
I still haven't read the instruction manuals that came provided with CSP or Affinity Photo or Affinity Designer. So, but my main reason for going for those is because been using a really old version of Photoshop for years for basic image editing. But to get the latest features, it's now subscription. It's very expensive, and I could buy Affinity Designer and actually Clip Studio for the price of less than 6 months worth of Photoshop subscriptions. So this is not a paid promotion for anyone watching this. I'm not sponsored by either Serif or by the people that make Clip Studio. But there's the workflow works. They're easily configurable. And also, particularly with Designer and Clip Studio, it allows you to mix both vector art and raster art. So particularly when you've got pictures of the TARDIS, you can just draw the lines in vector and you can move them, and they're easy to cut. And then the shading is all done using sort of pixel art, as a separate layer. So it's kind of, which I don't believe actually Adobe products can do. Photoshop can't do it, I don't think, and certainly Adobe Illustrator can't do it. One's vector, one's raster. So I just use pixels. But both these programs, the Affinity Designer and CSP, can mix and match. So I now use a mix of the nice thing about vector, if you draw a stroke, I think, using Affinity Designer, you can actually change, not only can you change the stroke and where it goes. If it's too long, you can make it a bit shorter without rubbing it out and doing it again. But also, if you like to have a slightly different ink style on the way you've drawn it, so a slightly rougher pen, just change the ink style, all of a sudden all the brush strokes, ink strokes change. So can't do that with real ink. And it's cheating a bit, I think, because ultimately, if you're used to doing traditional art, there's a bit of you thinking, it's going to press a button, it looks different, and instead of drawing another one. But you get used to it, and also it's a lot quicker and a lot less messy than using rotring pens and ink, which is what I used to do. So
Wow.
yeah,
That is so fascinating to hear about, and I've I've seen a couple of skits or videos online that are saying that the major experience with digital art is when you're doing it is actually just going, which layer did I put this this item
always
on?
label your layers. So
Yes.
it's got to the stage with now I'm using color. So Clip Studio allows you to have different folders. So you've got say for example the image I did for Manhattan Transference with the Dr. Sarden Stacy. There's a folder for each one of those characters. Within each one of those folders, there's kind of a pencils layer, which is the sketch, effectively. There's then an ink layer, which is the vector art for the outlines. And then there are multiple color layers. So you've got a base color for, say, let's pick Stacy's uniform, that sort of pale magenta color. There's then a shading and highlighting layer for that. Any sort of really high highlights, where there's specularity, there's another layer again for that. And if you don't label them with exactly what they are, you spend, each one of those images can have easily 30, 40 layers for a simple one. If you've, because you get more control with a layer because you can change its opacity down. So if the color is too strong, you either change the color or you can just make it paler. It gives you that level of control again traditional art doesn't do. Again, there's the traditional artist and he's saying, but the skill is in controlling the medium. If you're watercoloring, if you get it wrong, it all goes everywhere. But I didn't like watercolors anyway. but it's ultimately it's trying to get an image across. It's just a different tool. It's like pen and ink. It's like paint. It's like pastel. It's like pencil. It's just ones and zeros, and how you do it is differently. And also, from a submission of artwork point of view, it's really easy to draw a digital piece of art, save it, and then email it or FTP it over to your publisher. So rather than try and get a really high quality scan of a piece of traditional art, and then um, then sending that. The downside to digital art, of course, is there's technically no original. And I have been asked on a
Mhm.
couple of occasions, "Oh, that picture you did of whatever it was, it's are you selling the originals?" Well, there isn't one. Sorry, it's
It's
a
a
file on a computer. Sorry.
right, right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you almost need to, talk about the first printing, I guess, if you were to the first printing, first framing. But absolutely, I mean, the world of digital art, it's a different approach to art, and it's cool how you've. I think whether it's traditional or digital, in both cases, organization is so key, and certainly when you're talking about 30, 40 layers, and I mean that's in order to save yourself time and going mad from just trying to find a particular layer. It does sound like being organized comes in really, really handy there.
Yeah, I've got a setup now, because one of the things that Clip Studio is good at is something called auto actions, a bit like macros in Photoshop and the Adobe products, whereby I've got an auto action to basically set up a color uh, studio, as it were. So automatically it sets up all the folders. So character one, then it's got the inks, pencils, flesh tones, clothing colors, highlights, and then anything above and beyond that, I just add to it. It saves me a good sort of 10 minutes or so to begin with, just setting up it, because the folders are already there. I got something similar again for sort of pencil and ink sketches. So the programs are very good to, if you know you're going to do basically a comic book style black and white ink cartoon, I've got a set of tools immediately to hand for that. You know, going to do something with color. There's a color one. If it's just pencil sketches, I've got some very good um, pencil brushes, as it were, that look like real pencil. Um, so knowing what the final piece of art's going to be, you can pick a set of tools rather than just rummage through the massive toolkits that these art packages come with all the different brushes and types of nibs and what have you. I've picked my favorites out so that there's a bit more consistency, rather than just picking like 20 different types of pen like I would have done for the worry illustrations. You'll find that there's maybe only 3 types of digital pen I'm using on the images for Manhattan Transference, because it looks more consistent, and also the pen widths as well, the ink weights, as it were. I've narrowed it down to use of 3 rather than just picking anything. So again, the line width looks a bit more consistent, which was something I was noticing in other people's digital art, that it looked a lot more like they'd thought about what size pen shall I use. And ultimately, when I was using uh, rotring pens for art way back in the 80s as well, I only had 3 pens. I had a 1 millimeter nib, I had a 0.5 millimeter nib, I had a 0.35 millimeter nib. That's what I used. Anything beyond that, tough. I didn't have it. So, and that actually helps keep the consistent look to your ink drawings.
Right, right. That is so cool. I mean, I've heard from, several different writers and artists that, from annual to annual, and now even what you're saying from the first story you illustrated to the second story you illustrated, you're all constantly improving and growing. And so, I was very impressed with, say, the 1972 annual or the 1988 annual. But what I've heard from the different contributors is how each annual it just gets better and better because as artists, as writers, everybody's progressing. And even Mark the editor was saying his skills at editing have also improved over time. And so it is so exciting to see this sort of group culmination. One of the things that I talked with Chris about was the just the fascinating world of color theory and how a color can look different depending on the colors that it's surrounded by. And
Yes.
so we were talking about instances where, Sard as the ice warrior, it's green, but it's not just about picking out the color that looks green in isolation. You have to pick out a color that sometimes, in isolation will look less green than you would think because of its surrounding stuff. So did you run into certain things? So you mentioned, different colors and such. Were there any standout moments of like, wow, if people knew that this was actually the color that I was using, but in relation to everything else, it looks different?
Yeah, I mean, so my Sard illustrations were, let's pick on Sard because he uses, he's Ice Warrior is basically a bright green. They've got bright red eyes. There's no avoiding it. Two clashing colors. That's what they look like. So um, on the mainly the Sard portraits, it was a bit tricky to try and think. Okay, it's just bright greens, leaf green. But I quite like the idea of ice because I always thought that's the ones. There you go. Um, I was when I was younger, I was always under the impression that Ice Warriors were darker green. So in the 1970s, we had a black and white television, which was quite common in the UK back then. And watching Monster of Peladon, you see the Ice Warriors. I mean, it's one of my earliest memories of Doctor Who is the Monsters of Peladon and the final Pertwee season. Um, and you see then pictures in front of Target books, and quite frequently the Ice Warriors are painted much darker green than they were a luminous green originally. So for these, I tended to make them darker than perhaps they should have been a little bit, and just to make things interesting, I just think what's the most bizarre coloured background, like purple. I mean, I think purple and green. I mean, think of the Joker and Batman. They're great colours together. They clash
Yeah.
like nobody's business. Actually, this sort of collage I sent you over earlier is good because this isn't the finished product. You can see actually the at the bottom and at the edge of the picture, there's bleed where the layers just come off. The illusion is shattered. It's not actually a real Ice Warrior. It's just some blobs of colour. That's it around there. And also you can see some of the shading sort of speckles on the bottom of the red one as well.
Mm-hmm.
So and over the top I put that sort of TV interference as well. So I think really when it came to this one, because this is the only one I did with Sard in color and with the background, because of course the backgrounds were done by Richard Jones in the Manhattan Transference. I just let's pick a color and see what it looks like, so you have an idea. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, I did particularly that first illustration on the top left. Make the carapace intentionally a darker green because I quite like. And we'll tone the colours down. The eyes as well. The eye lenses should be quite bright red, but again, I've made them darker. Personally, I think it looks better, but ultimately, if you look at Sard as the Ice Warrior in the Radio Times, he's a much leaner Ice Warrior than they had in the TV series. Because in the TV series, they were big actors wearing huge fiberglass costumes.
Yes.
They were a bit lumpy. And when Lee Sullivan redrew it, I mean, the Ice Warriors can be whatever they look like. They're a bit leaner looking. But I, being a bit traditionalist, I kept them as the sort of 60s and 70s BBC Ice Warriors because I like them. They're just a bit too bright, that's all. So
I love that.
yeah, but you soon know when you've painted a background and you think, oh gosh, that color doesn't look very good. It's again another advantage of digital art. You can change the color quite easily and have a little play around with it. So you've got time to experiment because you haven't got to repaint or redraw the entire picture if you get it horribly wrong. But these were great fun to draw, because I had to try and find 4 reference shots that were quick to draw. So rather than just come up with it, these are based on photos of Ice Warriors, mainly in the 1960s, which I just did the ink drawings for and then just did color versions of them using, what I thought was an appropriate palette. And then hid most of it underneath all those interference lines that I eventually put over them, which was a nice filter set I found somewhere. But yeah, these were great fun to draw. And again, this was an 11th hour request to get an extra feature into the annual, which I turned around in about 3 or 4 days. I mean, I work full time, so
Wow.
this is a sort of an evening job over about 3 or 4 days.
Wow. I was going to ask about, the amount of time that it takes you to do each one. That is, wow, that's incredible.
So if I'm on a roll, I'm quite quick. Sometimes if you want the character that you want to look quite right, so getting the Eighth Doctor's face in the picture with the face lost with that sort of inset with the Doctor in. So I think you by the there we go, that one there. But getting Paul's lightness, again, you can see that this hasn't got the transparent background. You can see a bit of a bleed below the circle there. The illusion is shattered. And actually as well, once you've got when this is a PNG file with a transparent background, that sort of luminous radioactive green line is more of a sort of a ominous glow. And that's at this time I didn't know what the background was going to be exactly, so
Wow.
I just guessed. But yeah, getting Paul's expression right, or getting the lightness right is it took a little bit of tweaking. So I spent a bit of time on Paul's face there and getting all the curls right too, because it's quite a detailed piece. But generally speaking,
Yeah.
if a character or a part of a picture is much smaller and is not a key part of it, you can, in theory, spend less time, and put less detail in it. And the impression of something being there is more important. But with these two sort of hero shots, as it were, you want to make sure that there's a decent level of detailing. And again, the Kate Mara picture, which I saw you've got on one of your tabs there, was that one I spent a good couple of hours on, mainly to make sure she didn't look like Michelle Gomez, but also as well is finding the appropriate patterns to overlay on her blouse. So again, I didn't know how to do that properly using this art package until I did this picture. So I'm learning on the fly. So and weirdly, one of the things I've got quite good at, particularly doing 2 Blake 7 annuals now as well, I'm getting really good at over the top eye makeup. So because in Blake 7, the portraits I've done, they're all the female characters are wearing quite bright 1970s glittery makeup on their eyes.
Wow.
So it was doing the eye makeup on this actually didn't take that long. So maybe I've got a burgeoning career as a makeup artist. Who knows?
Yeah.
But this one was great fun to do. I really enjoyed doing it. Again, trying to get Kate's expression. I mean, quite luckily, most of her publicity photos, right the way from the 1960s when she started performing, right up to just before she passed away, she's always got one eyebrow arched. It's that Kate O'Mara look.
Yes.
So I was never short of a raised eyebrow in any of her photos. Which is getting that, trying to find the right expression on the right angle, and hoping it was of the right sort of age range. Because again, very much like Paul McGann, as we age, our faces change in a different way. And both Kate O'Mara and Paul McGann both got much leaner, and certainly with Paul McGann, he's got very chiseled features now. So in the Worry, one of the reference photos I used when he's holding the flask in his hand is actually taken from a more recent TV series on the BBC, that one. And if you look closely at his features, he's got much thinner sort of features and the jaws more defined. So actually thinking, that's modern day Paul McGann with longer hair, as opposed to he had much less defined features, as it were. I don't want to use the phrase puppy fat, but it was a long time ago, 27 years ago. I looked different back then. But yeah, it's you tend to learn, if we're going to do more Paul McGann things, I need to try and find either more early reference material or trying to make the modern stuff look less chiseled. So that looks more like sort of mid-90s Paul McGann rather than sort of 2020s Paul McGann. But
Right,
that's only for
because
the reasons of accuracy more than anything.
people will be looking at those and using them to try and pin these stories down in their chronology of the Eighth Doctor's timeline, which is a whole headache of a project anyway. But
Oh yeah, I suppose the other thing as well, sort of with this one, the reason I did the TARDIS on the battlefield as a silhouette is it's much easier to draw a silhouette and fill it in and just put the windows in and the sign than it is to actually draw all the panels like I did in the first illustration for this. So it was, and actually it looked really good. But again, it was a case of the clock was ticking. I'd promised this by the end of the week, and I had like a day left, and I thought, I know, let's just block it out as a silhouette. And it worked really well.
It's really stunning, and I absolutely love that. And I mean, the work that you do is just incredible. And I want to hop on over to this one as well to highlight that. I mean, now is this the one that you were saying, you studied models of this to get the right angle on the weapon?
Yeah. So the two things I had to do was how do you draw rain? Um, how do you draw ponchos on ice warriors? Um,
You
so
didn't have reference photos for that, I don't think.
no, I had to kind of sort of just draw an ice warrior outline and sort of drape material in pencil over it, and if it would sell. So again, it's I used to do some 3D rendering 20 years ago before cloth simulations came in. So if you wanted to do any form of um, cloak or cape or something, you had to do it in post production. Effectively, you had to sort of like render the figures and then draw the cape on. So you've got to sort of like drape a piece of material on, and how does it fall? So that was interesting. The World War One soldiers, um, I've never really thought about, if you're holding a Winchester rifle, how do you hold it? How do you aim your head? So there was, you know, quite a few people at that time were holding rifles. So I did find some reference photos to get the shape of the Winchester right and make sure someone's holding it in the right place. Again, did they wear full gloves? Did they wear fingerless gloves? And it's fingerless quite frequently. And again, I
Oh.
cheated by putting the officer in the foreground as mainly a silhouette with a highlighted profile
Mhm.
because A, it looks good, and B, it's really quick. So my artistic decisions are partially driven by how long have I got left,
Yeah.
and actually does it look good? And it does draw the attention to the middle of the picture because the outside of the picture is very dark. And again, there's a gradient going from the top right down, so it gives the impression that it's dark, it's dingy. There's a bit of light on the battlefield somewhere that's catching the rain,
Right.
and it also
Right.
highlights the ridge at the top of the trench as well. So um, yeah, I suppose in hindsight, would I have done this in color if I knew how to? I was doing it in black and white because at the time I didn't really know how to do the color stuff. So all my stuff was black and white. And I actually switched to color shortly after I finished the illustrations for the worry. And this would have taken forever because you've got uh, Paul's costume, the Eighth Doctor's costume, um, velvet jacket. I mean, velvet's difficult to draw anyway. Wet velvet, blimey, black and white is okay color. I'm not sure how you do that. And also, I didn't overlay the pattern on his waistcoat in this one. Where if you look at the color one I did for Manhattan Transference, I did manage to find, I think it was on a cosplay website, a piece of material that's virtually identical to the waistcoat. So I took a screen grab of that and overlaid it onto the and blended it with the waistcoat. So rather than draw the pattern by hand, again, one of the advantages of digital, you can sometimes blend it with actual patterns. So handy hint there for any budding digital artists. Um, but yeah, this is again color wise. It's supposed, I think, being in black and white or being monochrome, because in the annual they tinted them, which again wasn't
Mhm.
expecting, but looks really good. Um, Also lends itself to some of the older Doctor Who annuals, because the ones I used to get as a kid in the 70s either had
Yeah.
full color, quite bizarre illustrations most of the time that were done in watercolors. They were quite blotchy, but they also had quite a few that were uh, just tinted black and white pictures. Particularly if you go back to the early John Pertwee ones in the early 70s, they're ink drawings and they've just put maybe one or two colors on it, or just one color, different tonalities in it.
Yeah.
So in this, that kind of, once it was coloured in the annual, it's kind of reminded me of that, um, which is good, So
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. And, I suppose there would have also been budgetary implications in having more colored in illustrations.
back then, definitely, yeah. So the more colours you have, the more expensive it is, and also the type of print you're using would have been very different. So getting one colour in with black on the sort of very rough paper they used to use in the sort of 60s and early 70s annuals would have been more cost effective than having the very glossy, um, sort of TV 21 comic style, which was quite expensive. It looked fab, but it was very expensive to reproduce. And again, the artwork you would produce for those different types of magazines would vary depending on the quality of the output. I mean, today all these are print on demand, digitally printed, so the quality is really good.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's nice not to be restricted by that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if we look at some of the other ones we've got lined up here, Lee, this is from Manhattan Transference. This is one of the characters in the shot. We've got Stacy,
Mm.
and I mean, as you're talking about the different, as I've talked with different artists, I've seen a lot of just how much, because the curtain's been pulled back and it's not an area that I'm very familiar with what the backstage looks like. And there's just so much research. There's so much more to, even as you're talking about clothing, and there's often the base character drawn underneath and then the clothing laid on top, and so much research that goes into the blocking versus the actual time, because naively I thought, okay, how much time does it take you, and then that would be measured from the first stroke of the pen to the last stroke of the pen. But actually there's so much research and blocking and different reference photos that goes into it. What is, if you were to average out for these drawings, the is it a 50-50 split between research and looking at reference photos and blocking versus sitting down and actually drawing it? How does that sort of break down in a rough way? Because I know you weren't timing yourself.
Yeah, so it's a tricky one. If it's so the other thing that was also slightly awkward is Stacy was never portrayed by a real person. It's a comic strip, and actually the likenesses with Stacy and the annual with sort of haircuts and faces vary a little bit, so it wasn't massively important. But I was trying to keep it as close to Lee Sullivan's original as possible. So to begin with, I was trying to find facial references that, well, again, digging my own grave here, an expression that's looking upwards, compressed. It's a really awkward angle to draw properly. As if you compare Stacy looking upwards in this one compared to the worry, which in hindsight, if I did that again, I'd probably, yeah, I'd replace the face with something different because it just looks not quite right. That's the tricky bit, is kind of find a facial reference, and also then you've got to get the proportions where the nose, eyes, and mouth are if you're looking up, and then trying to make it look like the other Stacys that you've drawn. Interestingly, I did spot after I'd finished these that Lee's original pictures of Stacey bear a striking resemblance to an actress called Rosalind Landor, who was very big in the late 80s in the UK and appeared in, I think, a Star Trek Next Generation episode as well. We've got quite long features and sort of the same sort of Stacey-like eyes, sort of slightly almondy eyes. And in hindsight, I really should have sort of thought, actually, let's find as many pictures of Rosalind Landor as I can find and use her as the reference, because they'd look more like a more photorealistic version of what Lee did. But in the end, it doesn't matter. So there's a lot of research went into that. Trying to find the references for the uniform. So that was certainly for the worry, that would have been a problem had I had to draw the sort of the jumpsuit that Stacey's wearing in this. But actually, the bit that took the most time with these characters is the blocking out of the pose and making sure that it's in proportion. Does it look good? I mean, I did all the figures as individual figures because I was asked by Mark if I could do that so that they could use them and rearrange them for any promotional material afterwards when I told him what I had planned. So these are all done as separate illustrations rather than separate layers. I could have done the one there. And then sort of composited together at the last minute. But the bit that takes the most is the blocking and also the inking. The quick bit, weirdly, is actually the colouring. So once I've picked the colours, colouring takes, and doing the highlighting, the shading, probably takes about 25% of the entire drawing time. Most of the time is blocking it, getting the foundation right, getting the base drawing correct before you paint over it. Which is, it's a standard sort of art theory, is that if you spend most of your time on the foundations, the rest will look great. He said modestly. But yeah, with this particular one, again, with the picture of Paul McGann that went to the Eighth Doctor that went with this, it took me a long time to get the proportions of the head right, because there is no reference picture of the Eighth Doctor standing like that. So it's a separate reference of Paul McGann's head. I had to make it not from Doctor Who, so I had to add the hair, add that to a pose of someone standing there with their hands behind their back, and then map over, and draw what I thought the outfit would look like. So there's a lot of making stuff up, which is good because it's easier to make stuff up than it is to actually copy, or reference it across. So yeah, but for these photos, certainly the penciling and inking of the, as it were, of the characters takes the most time, and then the coloring is really quick. As long as you know which colors you're going to do. If you don't, then you spend forever trying to work out, should I use green or should I use yellow?
Sort of like picking fonts, right? You can spend ages.
Don't even get me started on that. I'm so pleased I don't do any typeface, sort of typography in this.
Well, and then there's one more picture that you sent over, which is from not these particular annuals, but this.
Stay tuned to the Avengers Volume 2. Yes.
Yes.
So this was so this is actually one I did last September. So Stay Tuned to the Avengers is a series of 2 books at the moment that are based on a fanzine of the 1960s Avengers TV series, The Avengers. And someone had an idea a few years ago of compiling them into a book very similar to the Doctor Who annuals, but reprinting the original features, and they needed some illustrators. So on the back of a picture of Ace from Doctor Who that someone spotted on Twitter, someone said, "Do you know the Avengers?" And I said, "Yeah, I've started watching them." Yeah, I said, "You fancy doing a couple of illustrations for a charity book?" "Yeah, no problem." So I did the A4 illustrations to begin with of Patrick Macnee, Diana Rigg, Honor Blackman, to go with, full A4 size, to go with the interviews with the original stars from back in the 80s and 90s. So for Volume 2, which they told us was coming out sort of pretty soon after Volume 1 got printed, because it was a really successful Roy success, they said, well, there's a feature in the Stay Tuned magazine from the 80s about how a potential crossover between Doctor Who and the Avengers would go, because sort of 1960s, swinging London. Could you do a picture that would do that? And so the first thing I thought of, 60s Daleks. Love a 60s Dalek. Actually, just to prove it, I have a little Emperor Dalek here. There we go. They are available. they can be seeked. They can be sourced.
Oh my gosh!
So, yeah. Oh, it's good to head moves. Very nice. So let's not get distracted by the Dalek too much.
Amazing.
We can do another interview about that if you like.
Yes.
So 60s Dalek, and people who are familiar with the TV Guide magazine, the UK Radio Times from the mid 80s, will recognise the layout of this as being a very famous one-page photograph from 1984 of Peter Davison standing in a derelict warehouse doorway with a Dalek in front of him from Resurrection of the Daleks. So, and I completely riffed that. The background is basically that. The angle of the Dalek is basically the Dalek, and instead of Peter Davison coming out the doorway, I got a picture of Diana Rigg in a leather catsuit in the background. So the one that got printed in the book actually has John Steed as well, but I thought it made the corner quite crowded. So the one I sent you, again, layers, you can just switch John Steed off if you want to, or if you just wanted John Steed, you could switch off Emma Peel. Or if you just wanted no Dalek, you have a picture of Emma Peel and John Steed just coming out of a warehouse. So digital art, yay. So this was a one full page A4 illustration on this article about what if there was a crossover, because the 2 series were both created by Sidney Newman. There's a lot of parallels between the 2. Wow. And you can see certainly the early series of the Avengers were done on videotape in the studio, just look like early Doctor Who. So you can see there's lots of similarities. But yeah, this is the Dalek took forever to draw. I mean, that took about 2 weeks.
I believe it. I believe it.
Time.
Yeah, and again, you chose that upward angle.
Yeah, well, it was lucky because I had a reference photo of that Dalek, and also I've got, as you noticed, Dalek figures that if need be, I could sort of do a bit of drawing from there. But I can definitely see why Lee Sullivan and Dave Gibbons both hated comic strips with the Daleks in. I think they're both on record as saying they weren't keen on them because they just got all the little blobs. They got the slats. They got the neck rings. They're just an absolute pain to draw. I mean, they're great, but they just take ages to draw.
Yeah, there's so much there. There's so much there. That's an amazing photo. And looking at it, I absolutely see the that resurrection uh, you know, references in there. That's amazing. I have so enjoyed our conversation today. I find it so easy to talk with Doctor Who fans, and like we've never met before, but here we are an hour in, and it's just been so much fun to talk with you. Um, Tell us where we can follow you on socials or find your find you online at all. Do you have a website? How can we check out your art and the future projects that you're going to be working
Well,
on?
I'm available on the main platforms. So for those people that still anchor onto the artist formerly known as Twitter X, you can find me under my alter ego there of Floppy Lion. Some people will know who Floppy Lion is. The tag is at Real Floppy Lion, RealFloppyLion. Just look for a little icon of a small toy lion with a keyboard. Long story. On Facebook and Instagram, you can find me as Andrew Parsons. There's a picture of me you can just make out a Doctor Who scarf around my neck. But the Instagram and Facebook is probably more a mix of everything from artwork, vintage reenacting. So a lot of vintage fashion on there. So my other half is a major league 1940s person, wardrobes full of 1940s clothes, real 1940s clothes. But whenever I do any new artwork, which hasn't been that much recently, decorating the house, it will go on there, and quite frequently I'll just put a bit of old stuff on there that perhaps hasn't been on there recently for new followers to see. So that's where you can find me. I don't have a dedicated website yet, but if I get more commissions in and more people say, "Hey, can you do a drawing?" More than happy to start doing something a bit more professional if it takes off even more.
Absolutely awesome. Well, all of those will be linked in the description down below for anybody who's watching this to find. Thank you so much for being here and for joining me today. It's been so lovely to meet you. I have just one more question for you, which is really quickly, if you could swap yourself out with, like, put yourself into any Doctor Who story, what story would it be?
Depends. Am I a character that survives to the end?
Absolutely. If you want to be, absolutely.
Which one would I want to be in?
Which one would
I
you
don't know.
want to live in?
That's a really mean question to throw at someone at the last minute.
No preparation. Well, I'll give you a second to think. One of the ones that I would choose would be Battlefield at the end of that story, because I want to be there, sat around the table with the Seventh Doctor and Ace and the Brigadiers, and having that
yes.
meal with, Arthurian knights. And I've just always wondered what did the Seventh Doctor cook up for that meal? Did the lawn mowing go well with an Arthurian knight who's never used one before? I wanted to see how that ended, so that would be my choice.
Interesting. The other thing I do as well is, and again, this is on Facebook, so it's not a secret. There is someone that produces fan films called Johnny Who, who's been going for years. And after spotting me in my Seventh Doctor outfit, asked him if I can, could I act and sound a bit like Sylvester McCoy. I play the Seventh Doctor in these, so my McCoyisms have got quite good. And in one of the scripts, I won't go into detail because it's a spoiler. There is a discussion that goes on about what happened afterwards at the Brigadier's cottage, very briefly.
Amazing.
Maybe you do want to be at that dinner actually, because it'd be interesting to see how what happens pans out. So yeah, it is something that more than one person's thought of. Which one would I want to be at? That's a really big question, because let's face it, all the stories are quite harrowing for the characters. Otherwise, they wouldn't be interesting.
Yes.
I think one of the ones I wouldn't mind being a character in is actually the Unicorn and the Wasp. Because I like Agatha Christie, I do like those old sort of mysteries. I would like to be one of the people that survives to the end, because not everyone does in that story. But
Yes.
again, it's a sort of 20s, 30s, I forget when it's set, 20s, sort of dinner party in a big house, and I do like a big house story and a murder mystery. So So maybe that one, but yeah, I'll give that some more thought. Actually, that's a really good question. So
Thanks. I'm also thinking of Black Orchid, where your 1920s reminded me, because Adric basically spends the whole story eating at a buffet, and I've always wanted to join him because that sounds really tasty, and I could just be there watching the action happen, not actually in any danger, but just eating from this buffet. So.
yeah, that would be quite good. I'd like to be in the TARDIS to teach the First Doctor some table manners about when he's eating a pineapple. So that might be
Yes.
an errant Cyberman that wanders in to go, yeah, a well prepared meal. Don't think so, you know.
Amazing, amazing. Well, thank you again so much for joining me today. This has been amazing.
You're very welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
Bye.
Okay, take care. Bye, everyone.